2 gunshots to the head. Silence. Empty beer bottles scattered across the concrete floor of the entryway of Building 13 in the 13th district of Aktau. Cigarette butts bearing fingerprints. Blood. A lot of blood. Kairat Bukhanov, known in criminal circles as Cross-Eyed Kaira, lies in his own entryway with a bullet-shattered skull. The killers had been waiting for him here for several hours, drinking, smoking, watching. They knew he would return home that very night. They knew the exact time. They knew there would be no security. It was a perfectly planned operation to eliminate one of Kazakhstan's most influential crime bosses. The night of December 14th to 15th, 2013, Aktau sleeps. A cold wind off the Caspian cuts through the city's empty streets. That night, in the entryway of an ordinary apartment building, something happens that will shift the balance of power in Kazakhstan's criminal underworld. Cross-Eyed Kaira is coming home. He doesn't know what's waiting for him. He doesn't know that these few steps from the front door to the staircase will be his last. 32 years. That is the age of the man whose name had terrorized competitors and forced businessmen to pay tribute. The crime scene spoke for itself. Investigators found what amounted to a true still life of professional assassination. 5 empty bottles of cheap beer, 2 packs worth of cigarette butts from different brands of cigarettes. That meant there were at least 2 killers. They were in no hurry. They drank, smoked, waited. Perhaps they talked about something. Perhaps they stayed silent. Professionals don't like idle words. Their task was to wait for the target and eliminate him, cleanly, quickly, without witnesses. Fingerprints from the bottles and cigarette butts were collected and sent for forensic analysis. But even that didn't help crack the case. Either the killers weren't in the database, or someone worked very hard to derail the investigation. The police were silent as partisans under interrogation. Secrecy of the investigation. That's all the cops told journalists and the victims' relatives. Dozens of officers stood watch near the building, yet no one commented on anything. The veil of secrecy was so thick it spawned hundreds of rumors and theories in Kazakhstan's criminal circles. Bukhanov was not just a street thug from the neighborhood. He was a man who had made a name for himself in the wild 90s and the early 2000s. His nickname, Cross-Eyed Kaira, was known from Aktau to Almaty, from Shymkent to the Russian border. The nickname came from a physical trait. The guy had a squinting gaze. But this peculiarity only added to his charisma. When Cross-Eyed looked at you with his signature stare, it made you uneasy. People said that gaze could read minds, see right through you. Businessmen who had dealings with Bukhanov later recalled that stare in nightmares. Kairat was born in 1981. He was a teenager when the Soviet Union collapsed. He watched the old world crumble and a new one rise from its ruins. Brutal, cynical, governed by money and force. In that world, he quickly found his place. By age 20, Bukhanov was already known in Aktau. By 25, he was recognized across Western Kazakhstan. By 30, he had become one of the key figures in the Four Brothers OPG, the country's most powerful criminal organization. 32 years old, and it all ended in a grimy entryway under the barrels of killers' guns. Cross-Eyed had a serious resume. He wasn't one of those who sit in the shadows issuing orders. Bukhanov was an active player who went out on jobs himself and handled matters personally. In 2006, Almaty Special Forces caught him right in the center of the southern capital. It was a serious operation. The cops had been tailing him for several weeks, knew all his routes and contacts. When Cross-Eyed was taken along with another crime boss during a business meeting, it seemed his career was over. But no. After a while, they released him. Just like that, without explanation. Either the evidence wasn't enough to hold up, or someone made the right phone calls. That was neither the first nor the last time Bukhanov slipped through the hands of justice. In April 2013, he was placed on a wanted list for hooliganism with the use of a firearm. The authorities did not disclose the details of the incident, but word in the underworld was that Cross-Eyed had gotten into a confrontation with some local businessman who refused to pay tribute. Bukhanov hid for several months, but was eventually arrested and sent to pretrial detention. It seemed like this time he would definitely get a sentence. But again, he got out. Shortly before his death, Kairat returned to his hometown of Aktau. He came back to die. The victim's relatives refused to speak to the press. The only thing they said was, "Let the police figure it out. They should know more." But the police said nothing. Police vans and patrols stood outside Bukhanov's building, yet everything was quiet. The cops worked their old script. No comments, no theories, no information. Even when journalists tried to find out anything at all, they got one answer: secrecy of the investigation. That phrase became a mantra for everyone connected to the case of Cross-Eyed Kaira's murder. Why such secrecy? There were many theories. Some said Bukhanov's murder was tied to major criminal schemes involving very influential people, perhaps officials, perhaps businessmen at the federal level. Others believed the police simply didn't want to rock the boat and provoke a new wave of criminal showdowns. A third group was convinced the cops knew who had ordered Cross-Eyed's killing, but couldn't or wouldn't touch the client. Whatever the case, the murder of Kairat Bukhanov remained unsolved. Officially, it is still open, but in practice, it was sent to the archive long ago. The story of Cross-Eyed Kaira is the story of an entire era of Kazakhstani crime. If you're interested in real criminal chronicles and not Hollywood fairy tales, subscribe to the channel. Hit like if you want to find out who really ruled the streets in the 90s and 2000s. Write in the comments which crime bosses of that era you'd like to hear about next. Real stories are always better than fiction. But to understand why Cross-Eyed was killed the way he was, and when, you need to dig deeper. You need to go back several years and look at who Bukhanov was, what role he played in the criminal structure, and who he might have gotten in the way of. And for that, you need to understand the organization that stood behind him, the legendary Four Brothers OPG. This was no mere gang of neighborhood thugs. Four Brothers was a true criminal empire that controlled entire sectors of the economy. Petroleum products, the gambling business, smuggling, all of it was under the group's control. They weren't simply collecting tribute from market stalls and minibuses. They dealt in billions of tenga, had connections at the very top, and were untouchable. At least, that's how it seemed. The name Four Brothers had nothing to do with blood ties. The group's leaders were not brothers. The nickname came from a Hollywood action film playing in the video salons of the 90s. The movie Four Brothers was popular back then. Four guys from different families who unite to avenge the murder of their foster mother. Kazakhstan's crime bosses took that concept and ran with it. Four people from different regions with different backgrounds united into one powerful structure. And that structure became a legend of the criminal world. Control over the petroleum products market, gasoline, diesel, oil, was a gold mine. Through Aktau and Almaty, the Four Brothers moved tons of fuel. Officially, these were legitimate companies with licenses and documentation, but behind the facade of legal business lay a clear criminal scheme. Petroleum products were purchased at deflated prices from corrupt refinery managers, then sold at market prices through shell companies. The difference went straight into the organizers' pockets. Millions of dollars per month. And that was just one revenue stream. The gambling business was another. In the 2000s and early 2000s, Kazakhstan was full of casinos, legal and otherwise. Four Brothers controlled several major establishments in Almaty. A former police officer who worked as a security guard at one such casino recalled, "They came into play almost every week. The money was clearly not from honest labor. They'd bet $50,000, $100,000 in an evening. Everyone was afraid of them. Even the casino's owner turned to silk the moment they walked in. He knew these people could shut down his establishment with one phone call, or simply have him removed. Alcohol smuggling across the Kazakhstan-China border was another operation entirely. In China, there was always demand for alcohol. Local producers couldn't keep up with volume. Four brothers established a supply channel. The spirit was either purchased from corrupt distillery directors or produced illegally. The product was then moved across the border through established schemes. Customs officials received their cut and looked the other way. Chinese partners took the goods wholesale and resold them through their own channels. Net profits counted in the millions. And this was just one branch of the business. Cross-eyed Kaira was an important link in this structure. He was responsible for Aktau, a port city on the Caspian coast and a major transport hub. Through Aktau flowed not only petroleum products, but also contraband. Bukhanov controlled these flows. He had connections in the port, at customs, in the local administration. When a problem needed solving, they called Cross-eyed. He handled it, quickly and efficiently. That's why he was respected in the group. That's why they paid him well. And that's why he was ultimately killed. But there was one distinguishing feature that set Bukhanov apart from other members of the OPG. He was simultaneously affiliated with two criminal groups. In addition to four brothers, Cross-eyed was connected to another criminal structure, Aishwak Jantugiel. This was a rarity in the criminal world. Such a thing was usually perceived as betrayal. But Bukhanov had the knack for balancing. He was authoritative enough that both groups tolerated his double game, or pretended to. In the criminal world, such things are rarely forgiven. Sooner or later, a choice must be made, or the killers in the entryway make it for you. Cross-eyed's sphere of influence stretched from Aktau to Almaty. He was a man equally comfortable in the port city on the Caspian and in Kazakhstan's southern capital. In Aktau, he had his own people, his own business, his own schemes. In Almaty, he met with partners, resolved matters at the highest level, and took part in dividing spheres of influence. He was known in Taldykorgan, in Jambil region, in Shymkent. Everywhere four brothers operated, the name Cross-eyed Kaira meant something. Bukhanov was not the type to sit at home and keep his head down. He moved actively around the country, met with the right people, monitored his channels. It was during one such trip to Almaty in 2006 that he was caught. Special forces detained him and another crime boss right in the middle of a meeting at a restaurant in the city center. The operation was high profile. Media reported the arrests of OPG members. But after a while, things quieted down. Bukhanov was released, officially for lack of evidence. Unofficially, connections had done their work. People like Cross-eyed didn't just sit in jail. They always had options. The four brothers' connections extended far beyond Kazakhstan's borders. The group maintained contacts with Georgian Thieves-in-Law. This was the elite of the criminal world. The Georgian criminal tradition carried enormous weight across the former Soviet space. If you were on good terms with Georgian bosses, you were somebody. Four brothers regularly hosted visiting thieves. They would meet, discuss business, divide spheres of influence. Cross-eyed Kaira took part in these meetings. He knew the Georgian bosses personally. That elevated his status in the criminal hierarchy. A former Interior Ministry officer who worked in the organized crime division in the 90s recalled, "They were very strong. Four brothers, it was a powerful structure. They shared influence with other groups while maintaining their own autonomy. They knew the Georgian thieves who came here. They organized meetings, gatherings. They settled serious matters. Ordinary thugs were not admitted to such meetings. This was a different level." According to him, Bukhanov was one of those who represented the group at such meetings, which means they trusted him, which means he was in the inner circle. But even the mightiest empires crack, and Four Brothers was no exception. The trouble began when the group became too closely intertwined with the authorities. In the criminal world, that's a dangerous game. On one hand, political connections offer protection and opportunity. On the other, they undermine credibility among one's own. Real thieves should not work with police and officials. It's against the code. And Four Brothers had crossed that line. The group's leader, Erkin Izbasarov, had a brother, Yerbolat Izbasarov. That man became the son-in-law of former regional governor Sergei Ryskaliyev. Ryskaliyev was accused of establishing a criminal organization that caused the state damage of more than 71 billion tenge. These weren't just large sums, they were astronomical. Ryskaliyev's schemes involved embezzlement of public funds, top-level corruption, and money laundering. And through family ties, Four Brothers got pulled into the case. When investigators began unraveling the Ryskaliyev affair, it struck the group's reputation. Rumors spread through the criminal world. Word was that Four Brothers worked for the government, that they had informed on someone to save themselves, that they had turned. In November 2014, Ryskaliyev's team received their sentences. But the shadow of this case fell on everyone connected to him, including Four Brothers. A former cop recalled, their credibility in the criminal milieu was tarnished. They used to be feared and respected, but when the story with Ryskaliyev came out, many people started looking at them differently. Rival groups began getting bolder. Before, no one would dare say a word against them. Now they weren't so afraid anymore. They understood that Four Brothers wasn't as untouchable as they had seemed. Cross-eyed Kaira found himself at the center of this situation. On one hand, he was part of a structure that was losing influence. On the other, he had his own ambitions and connections. His double game between two groups didn't win him any friends either. In the criminal world, there are always those who see such a thing as betrayal, or as an opportunity to eliminate a competitor under a convenient pretext. Perhaps someone in Aishuak Shantugiel thought Cross-eyed was too close to Four Brothers. Perhaps someone in Four Brothers believed Bukhanov was leaking information to the rival group. Or maybe someone newer simply decided that Cross-eyed's time had passed. Either way, in the spring of 2013, everything began to fall apart. An incident involving a firearm, a warrant, an arrest. Bukhanov was put in pre-trial detention, but even from there, he wriggled free. He was released and returned to Aktau. Only to find himself lying in a pool of blood in his own entryway a few months later. What happened that night of December 14th? Cross-eyed was coming home late in the evening. Perhaps he had been at a meeting somewhere. Perhaps he was simply out in the city. He didn't know that two men with guns had been sitting in his building's entryway for several hours. They were drinking beer, smoking, waiting. They had an order. Clean work, no unnecessary questions. 2 shots to the head, and done. No torture, no conversation. Simply the elimination of a target. Bukhanov entered the entryway. Perhaps he heard footsteps behind him. Perhaps he even managed to turn around. But it was already too late. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Both bullets struck the head. Cross-eyed fell. The killers left without looking back. They left behind only empty bottles, cigarette butts, and the body of one of Kazakhstan's most influential crime bosses. With an open head wound, with brain swelling, in a second-degree coma, Bukhanov was taken to the hospital. Doctors did everything possible. But 2 bullets to the head is almost always a death sentence. Cross-eyed never regained consciousness. He died around 6 in the morning on December 15, 2013, in the intensive care unit of Aktau's city hospital. He was 32 years old. The murder of Kairat Bukhanov became a landmark event in Kazakhstan's criminal history. This was not just another contract killing of a crime boss. It was a full stop at the end of an entire era. An era when Four Brothers ruled the criminal world. After Cross-eyed's death, the group began its slow decline. Other OPG members also became targets. Some were arrested, some went underground, some fled abroad. The empire crumbled. Near Bukhanov's building, funeral preparations began. The relatives were silent. The police were silent. The whole city was silent. Only rumors spread through Aktau like a steppe wildfire. Some said it was revenge for old sins. Others claimed the order came from Almaty. Some whispered that officials were behind the killing, trying to cover their tracks. There were many theories. No one knew the truth. The investigation stalled almost immediately. Fingerprints yielded nothing. There were no witnesses. There were no cameras in the entryway. The killers vanished into the night without a trace. The murder case of Kairat Bukhanov is formally still open, but in practice, it was quietly closed after a few years. Unsolved, unavenged, forgotten by everyone except those who knew Cross-Eyed personally. Cross-Eyed Kaira's story doesn't end there. His name became legend. People in Aktau still tell stories about him. Some revere him, some curse him, but no one stays indifferent. He was a striking figure of his time, a man who played by his own rules and lost the final round. To understand who truly stood behind Cross-Eyed Kaira's murder, you need to understand the structure of the Four Brothers OPG. This was not just a gang of thugs shaking down market stalls. It was a genuine criminal corporation with a clear hierarchy, divided spheres of influence, and connections at the very top. And at the head of this empire stood a man who ran everything from a wheelchair. Erkin Izbasarov, a name that struck fear into anyone who was in the know. The leader of Four Brothers, a living legend of Kazakhstani organized crime. In 1998, Izbasarov was in a horrific car accident. The car was totaled. His spine was broken. His legs gave out. Doctors said he wouldn't survive. But Erkin survived. He was treated for a long time in Moscow, in the finest clinics. Attempts were made to get him back on his feet. It didn't work. He permanently lost the ability to walk, but not the ability to manage a criminal empire. The wheelchair did not stop Izbasarov from remaining at the top. On the contrary, he became even harder, even more calculating. From Almaty, he directed all the group's operations. He decided who to bring into a job, who to eliminate. He distributed revenues, settled conflicts with other OPGs. At the same time, Erkin was known as a sports patron. He invested in wrestling in Aktau region, sponsored athletes, built training halls. A classic scheme, launder dirty money through sports while building an image as a philanthropist. Izbasarov's inner circle was carefully selected. Every person in the structure knew their place and their responsibilities. Sedek Matishev was one of the group's key players. Born in 1968 in Zhambil region, he started from the bottom, clawing his way up with fists and brains. By the 90s, he was already a respected figure in his region. When Four Brothers coalesced as a unified structure, Matishev joined the leadership. He was responsible for the southern direction, Shymkent, Taraz, all of Zhambil region. There, he had his own people, his own schemes, his own business. Kurmangali Satibaldiev was another important figure. Born in 1965 in Turkmenistan, he had long since settled in Kazakhstan. His zone of responsibility? Aktau and everything connected to the port. According to law enforcement information, Satibaldiev controlled the seaport in Aktau and handled all customs matters. That was a gold mine. Through the port flowed contraband, from cigarettes to drugs, from weapons to illegal migrants. Satibaldiev took a cut from every container that passed through customs on fraudulent documents, millions of dollars per month. Kairat Bukhanov in this structure was the link between Almaty and Aktau. He lived in the port city but constantly traveled to the southern capital for meetings with Izbasarov and other leaders. Cross-Eyed have his own people in both cities. In Aktau, he controlled a share of the petroleum market, provided protection for several major firms, and handled matters with the local administration. In Almaty, he had connections in the gambling business, contacts with other groups, and access to major businessmen. But there was one detail that made Bukhanov's position precarious. He was simultaneously affiliated with two OPGs, Four Brothers and Aishuak Jantugiel. It was a dangerous game. In the criminal world, dual loyalty is perceived as betrayal. Such things usually end badly. But Cross-Eyed managed to balance. Perhaps he had agreements with both sides. Perhaps he was so respected that both groups looked the other way. Or perhaps they were simply waiting for the right moment to resolve the matter radically. Aishuak Jantugiel was a serious organization that competed with Four Brothers for influence in western Kazakhstan. Between the groups, there was an unspoken non-aggression pact. They divided spheres of influence and tried not to trespass on each other's territory. But conflicts still arose, and Bukhanov, operating within both structures simultaneously, could find himself caught between two fires. If Four Brothers learned something they didn't like about Cross-Eyed's ties to Aishuak Jantugiel, it could cost him his life, and vice versa. The Four Brothers business was running like a well-oiled machine. Control over petroleum in Aktau and Almaty brought stable income. The scheme was simple and effective. At the oil refineries, their people, managers who took a percentage, would sell petroleum products at deflated prices. The group would buy gasoline and diesel for, say, 100 tenga and sell it through shell companies for 150. The difference went to the organizers. The volumes were enormous, hundreds of tons per month. Profits counted in millions of dollars. In 2016, the National Security Committee uncovered a major oil theft scheme at an Aktau refinery. The operation was run by none other than Erkin Izbasarov himself. He was detained in Almaty along with his driver and bodyguard. The security services had been working on the case for months. Surveillance, wiretaps, collecting evidence. When they moved in, it was precise. Izbasarov was taken to a pre-trial detention facility. An invalid in a wheelchair who had been untouchable for years was finally behind bars. The gambling business was another gold mine. In the 2000s, Kazakhstan was home to dozens of casinos, legal and underground. Four Brothers controlled several major establishments in Almaty. They didn't own them directly, that would have been too obvious. But they provided protection, took a percentage of turnover, and dealt with the police. Casinos meant live money, cash that was easy to launder and move. Plus, the gambling business attracted wealthy clients with whom you could arrange other deals. A former security guard at one of the Almaty casinos recalled those times without much enthusiasm. When they walked in, everyone tensed up. The director immediately became a different person, polite, accommodating, ready to fulfill any request. They played big. Stakes from $50,000 a hand. They'd lose hundreds of thousands in an evening and not blink. Where that money came from was obvious. Everyone knew it was criminal, but no one said anything. They were afraid. These people could shut down the casino with one phone call, or eliminate the owner entirely. The group operated brazenly but calculatingly. No showdown in the streets, no daytime shootings. They worked quietly, through schemes and connections. They bought officials, cops, judges. They built a network of people who shielded their activities. And it worked, for years. Four Brothers was practically untouchable. Everyone knew what they were doing, but no one could prove anything, or didn't want to. The alcohol smuggling operation across the Kazakhstan-China border ran like clockwork. China had enormous demand for alcohol. Official supplies didn't cover even half the need. That's where Four Brothers came in with their offers. The spirit was purchased at Kazakhstani factories for next to nothing, or produced illegally, in garages, basements, abandoned factory shops. Quality was questionable, but the Chinese weren't especially bothered. What mattered was volume and price. The product was moved across the border through established channels, through desert stretches of the border where customs agents could easily be bought. Trucks with fake documents and forged stamps. Sometimes the goods were simply thrown across the border at night. In the border zone, there were plenty of places with no real oversight. Chinese partners met the shipment on their side, paid in cash. The scheme ran for years and brought stable income, and no one could do a thing. These schemes operated for decades. Entire criminal empires were built on such operations. If you're interested in the real history of organized crime in Kazakhstan, hit subscribe. Only here will you find real facts, verified sources, and no fiction. Leave a like and write in the comments which other criminal groups from the 90s interest you. History remembers everything. Connections with Georgian thieves-in-law elevated the four brothers to a new level. The Georgian criminal tradition is the foundation of all post-Soviet organized crime. Thieves-in-law are the elite of the criminal world. Getting into their circle, earning their respect, that's worth a great deal. Four brothers managed to establish those contacts. Georgian bosses regularly came to Kazakhstan. They met with the group's leadership, discussed business, resolved territorial questions. These gatherings were not merely dinners around a table. They were serious summits where the fate of entire regions was decided. Who controlled what territory? Who was responsible for what? How to divide profits from shared ventures? The Georgians had connections throughout the former Soviet Union, from the Baltics to the Far East. Through them, you could reach any region, deal with any group. That opened enormous opportunities for four brothers. Cross-eyed Kaira attended these meetings. He was brought along because he was an authoritative figure in the structure. Bukhanov knew the thieves' code, knew how to carry himself, could negotiate. The Georgians respected him, and that, in the criminal world, means a great deal. But those same connections could play a cruel trick on him. There were always those who were envious. Someone may have decided Cross-eyed was getting too big for his boots, or that he was using his Georgian connections for personal gain rather than for the group's benefit. A former detective from the organized crime unit recalled, "They were strong precisely because of their connections. They had access to Georgian thieves, to Chechen groups, to Slavic OPGs. They could resolve any matter with one phone call. Need to move cargo across the whole country? No problem. We have people everywhere. Need someone eliminated in another city? Call the partners. Done." It was a genuine network, and Bukhanov was one of those who maintained that network. But any empire eventually cracks. For four brothers, the beginning of the end was their entanglement with the authorities. Erkin Izbasarov's brother was Yerbolat Izbasarov, and Yerbolat became the son-in-law of Berge Ryskaliyev, a former regional governor who faced criminal charges for establishing a criminal organization and embezzling public funds. The damage to the state exceeded 71 billion tenga. This wasn't just money, it was a regional catastrophe. Ryskaliyev's schemes were multi-layered: kickbacks on government contracts, embezzlement of budget funds through shell companies, laundering through offshore accounts. Dozens of officials, businessmen, and security officials were involved, and through family ties, four brothers became entangled in it all. When investigators began unraveling the Ryskaliyev case, everyone connected to him came under fire. In November 2014, his associates received their sentences. Some got prison terms, some bought their way out, some fled abroad. For four brothers, this was a severe blow to their reputation. In the criminal world, ties to authority are a double-edged sword. On one hand, protection and opportunity. On the other, a destruction of credibility. Real thieves should not work with cops and officials. It's against the code. When the Ryskaliyev story emerged, many in the criminal world began looking at four brothers sideways. Rumors spread that they had become turncoats, that they worked for the government, that they were informing on their own. The group's authority began to slip. Before, nobody dared cross them. Now, competitors started getting bolder. Some thought Four Brothers wasn't what it used to be, that it was possible to push them back, grab a piece of their business, buy off their people. And that was a dangerous trend. In the criminal world, weakness is sensed immediately, and once you start losing ground, you get finished off, quickly and brutally. A retired Interior Ministry officer who had worked the organized crime beat in the 90s explained the situation this way. The Four Brothers group carried enormous weight. They were feared, but when it came out that they were linked to Ryskaliyev, everything changed. The criminal world has unwritten rules. You can't work too closely with the authorities. You can bribe cops, you can make a deal with an official, but to become part of their schemes, that's something else. That's a betrayal of the code. And when it came to light, the group's credibility collapsed. Cross-eyed Kaira found himself in the center of this meat grinder. He was tied to a group that was losing influence. He himself had ambitions, connections, and his own interests. Plus, his double game between two OPGs. It was a cocktail that sooner or later had to explode. And it did. That night, in the entryway of Building 13/39. In spring 2013, an incident occurred that became the beginning of the end. Bukhanov was put on a wanted list for hooliganism involving a firearm. The details of the incident were never officially disclosed, but word in the underworld was that Cross-eyed had gotten into a serious confrontation. Some businessman had refused to pay tribute, or had decided to move under another group's protection. Bukhanov came to sort things out. The conversation went badly. Cross-eyed pulled out a gun. Maybe he even fired. Maybe he just threatened. But the incident became public. Bukhanov went on the run for several months. He moved around the country, staying with one person, then another. But eventually, he was caught and sent to pre-trial detention. It seemed like this time he would definitely be sentenced. Use of a weapon, threats, possibly attempted murder? Those are serious charges. But Cross-eyed got out again. After some time, he was released. Officially, for lack of evidence or through amnesty. Unofficially, through connections. People like that always had options. Bukhanov returned to his native Aktau in autumn 2013. He came back thinking the worst was over, that he'd avoided a sentence, that life was going on. But he failed to account for one thing. In the criminal world, nothing is forgotten, especially grievances, conflicts, debts. And if someone had decided it was time for you to go, you would go. The only question was when. There are several theories about who could have ordered Cross-eyed's killing. The first, revenge for the spring incident with the weapon. Perhaps the victim or his people decided not to forgive. They waited until Bukhanov was released, then arranged the shooting. A classic scheme. Not through the courts, but by the code. The second theory, rivals from other groups. Cross-eyed controlled serious pieces of business in Aktau. Someone coveted those pieces. They eliminated Bukhanov and took his share. The third theory? Internal conflict. Perhaps someone in Four Brothers decided Cross-eyed was overstepping, or they discovered his ties to Aishwak Jantugyel and called it betrayal. Or they simply found a pretext to get rid of an inconvenient man. In an OPG, that happens. Today you're a brother, tomorrow you're a body in the entryway. Brutal. But that is the reality of the criminal world. The fourth theory, a cleanup before major troubles. Perhaps someone at the top of the group sensed that problems with the authorities were coming. The Ryskaliyev affair was gaining momentum. They may have decided to eliminate those who knew too much. Cross-eyed was aware of all the schemes, knew all the participants, held compromising information. His liquidation could have been a preemptive move. Eliminate a witness before he could tell investigators anything. The fifth theory, an order from above. From people in power who were connected to Four Brothers through Ryskaliyev. Perhaps Bukhanov had become inconvenient. He knew something he shouldn't, was threatening someone. or simply was too prominent a figure who could draw law enforcement attention. Such contracts are usually executed quickly and cleanly. 2 shots to the head, no witnesses, no traces. Which of these theories is correct? No one knows. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Perhaps the interests of several parties converged in Cross-Eyed's murder. One person wanted revenge, another wanted the business, a third wanted to cover their tracks, and together they organized the perfect murder. 2 killers in an entryway, beer, cigarettes, a few hours of waiting, 2 shots, and it's done. Problem solved. The police never officially presented any theories. Secrecy of the investigation, and that was that. Bukhanov's relatives kept quiet too. They understood it was better not to poke around in these matters. In the criminal world, there is a rule. If it doesn't concern you, don't get involved. Otherwise, you could be next. So everyone stayed silent, pretending they knew nothing, and the case quietly found its way to the archive. A year after Cross-Eyed's death, a video appeared online, purportedly showing Bukhanov. The footage was shot several years before his death. In it, a man in expensive clothing, with a distinctive squinting gaze, is speaking with someone on the street. There was no official confirmation that this was Cross-Eyed Kaira, but many people recognized Bukhanov. The video spread rapidly across Kazakhstan's corner of the internet. It was viewed hundreds of thousands of times. People discussed it in the comments, built theories, and recalled stories about him. This video became a kind of period document, one of the few visual traces left by Cross-Eyed Kaira. The footage showed how a criminal boss of that era carried himself. A confident stride, forceful gestures, a gaze that allowed for no weakness. He was a man accustomed to commanding, making decisions, not looking back at others. And that same man, a few years later, would lie in a pool of blood in his own building's entryway. After Bukhanov's murder, the slow collapse of Four Brothers began. The group had lost one of its key figures. The Aktau connections weakened. Control over the business started fragmenting. Other OPGs sensed weakness and began pressing in. Part of the territory fell to competitors. Some people switched to other bosses. The empire that had been built over decades began to crumble. In 2016, the National Security Committee detained Erkin Izbasarov. The group's leader was taken in Almaty in connection with the oil theft scheme at the Aktau refinery. Along with him, his driver and bodyguard were detained. The security services had spent months preparing the operation. Surveillance, wiretaps, gathering evidence. When they moved cleanly. Izbasarov was taken to a detention facility. An invalid in a wheelchair who had been untouchable for years was finally behind bars. That was the end of an era. Cross-Eyed Kaira had been in the ground for 3 years. Erkin Izbasarov was sitting in pre-trial detention. Other members of the group had either scattered or gone underground. Four Brothers ceased to exist as a unified structure. The business was picked apart, the connections dissolved, the people defected. From the great criminal empire, only stories remained, the kind that old crime bosses tell young men. But the story of Cross-Eyed Kaira did not end there. His name became legend. In Aktau, people still remember him. Some with respect, some with hatred. But all acknowledge. He was a remarkable figure of his time. A man who played by his own rules and reached the very top. The ending was tragic, but the journey was impressive. 12 years had passed since that night when Cross-Eyed Kaira fell in his own entryway with 2 bullets in his skull. 12 years of silence, of mystery, of an unsolved crime. But in January 2025, the story of Kairat Bukhanov resurfaced. The video hosting platform RuTube, the VDoc channel, a documentary film about the Four Brothers OPG, about Cross-Eyed, about Izbasarov, about the entire era that so many wanted to forget. The video accumulated thousands of views within days, Comments poured in like a flood. A new generation was discovering the story of Kazakhstan's criminal underworld of the 90s and 2000s. Why now? Why, 12 years after the murder, did people revisit Bukhanov? The answer is simple. Time has passed. Witnesses have aged or died. The case is officially closed, and it's now possible to talk. Before, it was dangerous. Too many living participants, too many people who might take offense at the wrong words. Now, everything had changed. 4 brothers no longer existed. Cross-eyed was dead. Izbasadov was in prison, or had come out and gone to ground. The stories could be told. The youth born in the 2000s and 2010s did not witness that era. For them, it's already history, almost legend. Stories about how things used to be, when the streets were controlled by men in crimson blazers, when a business couldn't survive without protection, when one call to the right person resolved any question. These stories captivate. They show a world that no longer exists, brutal, cynical, but in its own way, honest. It had its own rules, its own code, its own justice. The story of cross-eyed Kaira fits perfectly into that context. A guy from an ordinary family who made a name for himself in the criminal world, rose from the bottom to the very top, controlled millions, had connections from Aktau to Almaty, was on friendly terms with Georgian thieves-in-law, and all of it ended with 2 shots in a grimy entryway. A classic tragedy, rise and fall, glory and death. Such stories always capture attention. Aktau still keeps legends of cross-eyed. The old-timers tell the young about those times. They point out the building where he was killed, the 13th district, building number 39. An ordinary apartment block, nothing remarkable about it. But for those who know, this place carries special meaning. Here, the life of one of the city's most influential crime bosses came to an end. Here, a full stop was placed at the end of an entire era. The city of Aktau in 2013 was very different from the modern city. Back then, you could still feel the influence of criminal structures. Certain neighborhoods were controlled by certain people. Business without protection could not survive. Any attempts to open a shop, a cafe, or a fuel station without clearing it with the local bosses ended badly. People would come and have a conversation. Usually, one talk was enough. If they didn't understand the first time, people came a second time, not to talk. Cross-eyed Kaira was one of those who oversaw these processes. He had his own zone of responsibility in the city, certain streets, districts, types of business. Everyone knew, if you wanted to operate on Cross-eyed's turf, you had to deal with him. The rates varied. Major businesses paid a percentage of profits. Small ones paid a fixed sum once a month. Some paid in money, some in services. The main thing was to be inside the system. There were, of course, those who tried to work outside it, not to pay, not to deal, to operate independently. Those were spoken to more harshly. First came a warning, then a demonstration of force, smashed windows, slashed tires, intimidated employees. If that didn't work, more serious measures followed. Arson, beatings, in extreme cases, elimination. The system ran smoothly, and Bukhanov was an important cog in its mechanism. His people were everywhere, in the port, at customs, in the city hall, in the police. A network of informers and enforcers covered the whole city. If something needed to be known, they called the informers. If something needed to be done, they sent the enforcers. Cross-eyed sat at the center of this web and pulled the strings. He knew everything happening in Aktau, who was meeting whom, who was planning what, who was cheating whom. Information is power, and Bukhanov had plenty of information. The petroleum business in Aktau is sacred. The city lives on oil. The port ships petroleum products. The refineries process them, the companies trade them. Billions of tenga circulate in this sphere. and 4 brothers, through cross-eyed Kaira, controlled a significant slice of that pie. The schemes were varied. In some places, they took a percentage of legitimate deals. In others, they organized illegal supply chains. In still others, they simply stole, from tankers, from warehouses, from pipelines. The theft of petroleum products was organized on an industrial scale. The refinery had their own people, managers, guards, drivers. They would pass along information about shipments, schedules, volumes. A team would plan the operation. At night, tanker trucks would be brought in, fuel siphoned off, and taken to clandestine storage. In the morning, a shortage would be discovered. An investigation would begin. They'd find a scapegoat, usually someone from the lower staff. They'd be fired, maybe charged, but the real organizers stayed in the shadows. Bukhanov's role in these schemes was that of coordinator. He brought all the participants together. He negotiated with the people at the refinery, organized the transport, found buyers for the stolen oil. That required organizational skills, connections, and authority. Cross-eyed had all of it. For each successful operation, he received his cut. The sums were enormous. 1 tanker of stolen oil meant hundreds of thousands of tenge in clean profit, and there were dozens of operations per month. On this money, Bukhanov lived large. Expensive cars, apartments, vacations abroad. He wore designer clothing, sported expensive watches, didn't skimp on entertainment. But he didn't flaunt it excessively. He understood. A lifestyle that's too flashy attracts attention. From the authorities, from competitors, from the envious. He tried to stay in the shadows, not show himself in public places, not give grounds for talk. But concealing his status completely was impossible. In the city, everyone knew who cross-eyed Kaira was. He had a family, a wife, children. They lived an ordinary life. The children went to school, the wife ran the household. Bukhanov tried not to draw them into his affairs. At home, he was simply a father and husband. On the street, a criminal boss. He kept those 2 lives sharply separate. The family knew what he did, but the details were not discussed. That was the rule. Say as little as possible. The less you know, the better you sleep. When Cross-eyed was killed, the family was left without a breadwinner, but not without money. Men like him always kept reserves, bank accounts, real estate, savings. The group also helped. By the code, you were supposed to support the family of a fallen comrade. They gave money for the funeral and for living expenses. The children were able to finish their studies, and the wife didn't go without. But the psychological trauma remained. Losing a loved one like that, it's a shock you don't recover from for years. Bukhanov's funeral was quiet. No pomp, no crowds. The relatives deliberately kept it low-key. They feared attention. From the police, from competitors, from the merely curious. He was buried quickly, modestly. At the cemetery, only those closest to him gathered. No speeches, no farewells. They simply lowered the coffin into the ground and dispersed. That's what the family wanted. Cross-eyed left quietly, though he had lived loudly. The grave is in an ordinary section of the cemetery. The headstone is simple. Black granite, a photo, the dates. No grandiose inscriptions, no decorations. Relatives come a few times a year, on his birthday, on the anniversary of his death, on religious holidays. They tidy the grave, lay flowers, pray. Few other visitors come. Time passes. People forget. Even former comrades from the group rarely stop by. They have their own problems, their own lives. But in tight circles, Cross-eyed is remembered. Old crime bosses who worked with him in those years sometimes recall him over drinks. They tell stories. How Cross-eyed resolved problems, how he got out of tight spots, how he kept his word. In the criminal world, people like that are valued. Those who were honest by the code, didn't betray their own, didn't inform to the police. Bukhanov was that kind of man. For all his sins and crimes, in his world, he was a man of his word. After his death, Aktau gradually changed. The authorities began cracking down on the criminal world harder. The new city governor set the task: clean the city of OPGs. Arrests, searches, and inspections began. Many crime bosses of that era either went to prison or disappeared from sight. Some moved into legitimate business, laundered their money, and became respectable entrepreneurs. Some simply went quiet, stopped being visible, and now live peacefully. The system built by four brothers and cross-eyed Kaira collapsed. It was replaced by another system, more legal but no less corrupt. Now, protection is provided not by a gang, but by officials. Now, matters are resolved not by the code, but through kickbacks and connections. The substance is the same, only the form has changed. Kazakhstan has changed, but some things have remained the same. The younger generation of Aktau is growing up in a different world. They don't know what it's like to live in a city where criminal bosses decide everything. They haven't seen street confrontations, haven't heard gunshots in the night. For them, it's the stuff of movies. But it was reality for their parents, and the memory of it lives in the city to this day. The 13th district today looks ordinary. Children play in the courtyards, people go to the shops, life flows on. Nothing recalls that December night in 2013. Only old-timers sometimes point to Building 39 and say, "That's where they killed Cross-eyed." Young people listen with interest. Some believe it, some think it's just stories. But the story lives on. A documentary video on RooTube in 2025 sparked a new wave of interest. People started Googling, searching for articles, asking around. Who was Cross-eyed Kaira? What was Four Brothers? How did it all happen? Many questions, few answers, almost no official sources. All that remains are the recollections of participants and witnesses. And those recollections are gradually disappearing, along with the people who hold them. In 10 or 20 years, only historians and journalists digging through archives will know about Cross-eyed Kaira. Ordinary people will forget. The story will become a legend, the legend a myth. And perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps it's not necessary to preserve the memory of a criminal past. We should look forward, build the future. But history is part of who we are, and it cannot be forgotten, even if it is dark and bloody. Kairat Bukhanov lived his life the way he saw fit. He chose the path he chose. He climbed to the top and fell from it. He left a mark on Kazakhstan's history, a dark one, a criminal one, but a mark. He is remembered. His story is told. His name has become a symbol of an era, the era of the wild 90s and 2000s, when the rules of the game were different. The double game Bukhanov played, working with two groups at once, was thin ice. One wrong step, and you fall through. Cross-eyed walked that ice for several years. He managed to balance, to stay upright, not to fall. But ice cannot stay solid forever. Sooner or later, it cracks. For Bukhanov, it cracked on that December night. His ties to Aishwag gave him additional opportunities. Through that group, he could obtain information unavailable within Four Brothers. He could organize operations the main group knew nothing about. That brought money, but it was also mortally dangerous. If Four Brothers found out he was working on the side, it was over. If Aishwag decided he was using them, also over. Cross-eyed was playing Russian roulette, and he lost. The theory that he was killed specifically for playing both sides looks plausible. Perhaps information surfaced in one group that someone didn't like. Perhaps someone exposed Bukhanov, revealed his connections. They decided to deal with it by the code. 2 shots to the head, the standard punishment for betrayal in the criminal world. Fast, harsh, no discussion. Sentence carried out. The Georgian thieves-in-law, with whom Cross-Eyed maintained ties, could also have been involved. In the thieves' world, the rules are very strict. The slightest deviation from the code is punished harshly. If Bukhanov had transgressed in some way, the thieves could have pronounced judgment on him. Not personally, of course. That's not how they work. But giving the green light for his elimination, easily. And from there, local enforcers do their job. The two killers in the entryway could well have been acting on the blessing of Georgian bosses. The spring 2013 incident with the weapon remains a mystery. What was it? Who was the conflict with? Why did he pull the gun? There are no answers to these questions. The police are silent. Relatives say nothing. Witnesses are afraid. You can only speculate. Perhaps it was a confrontation with a debtor. Perhaps a conflict with competitors. Perhaps personal revenge for some old grievance. But the fact remains, after that incident, Bukhanov was arrested. And after he was released from pretrial detention, he was killed. The connection is obvious. Perhaps the person Cross-Eyed had the conflict with ordered his killing after his release, waited for him to get out, and arranged the shooting. That's logical. In the criminal world, it's done that way often enough. You don't kill someone immediately. You wait for the right moment. Bukhanov got out, returned to Aktau, relaxed. He thought it was all behind him. And then, bang bang, 2 shots, the end. A classic delayed revenge scheme. Erkin Izbasarov's role in Cross-Eyed's fate is also unclear. Did the group's leader know about Bukhanov's double game? Did he approve of it? Or did he find out just before Cross-Eyed was killed and give the go-ahead for elimination? Izbasarov was a hard man. His disability did not prevent him from keeping the group under an iron grip. If he decided someone had become a problem, he resolved the problem radically. Perhaps Bukhanov had become such a problem, and Izbasarov made the decision. On the other hand, if Izbasarov were the client, the killing would have been more demonstrative. Thieves like to make examples. To kill a traitor publicly so everyone knows, that's the thieves' way. But here was a quiet job in an entryway, no publicity. That looks more like a cleanup. Eliminate a witness, cover the tracks, draw no attention. Perhaps the client was someone who didn't want noise, an official or businessman connected to the group. The theory involving an order from above, from people in power connected to the Ryskaliyev affair, also has merit. When the investigation of the regional governor began to unravel, many of those implicated in the schemes panicked. They began tying up loose ends, eliminating witnesses. Bukhanov was one of those who knew too much. Money had passed through his hands. He had been present at meetings. He had seen documents. His testimony could have sent dozens of people to prison. And so they may have eliminated him preemptively. Such contracts are usually placed through multiple layers of intermediaries. The client has no direct contact with the executors. There are middlemen who organize everything. Money is transferred through straw men. Killers are found through vetted channels. Everything is arranged so no thread leads back to the client. And this typically works, which is precisely why most contract killings go unsolved. Too many layers, too little evidence. In Cross-Eyed's case, it was exactly that. Professional work. The killers waited a long time, chose their moment, did the job, left. They left minimal traces. Fingerprints on the bottles and cigarette butts led nowhere. Either they were not in the database, or someone had them cleaned. The second option means the client had connections in law enforcement, was able to make a call and get information removed from the database. Possible. In Kazakhstan, a great deal is resolved with phone calls. The investigation was conducted perfunctorily. They questioned the neighbors. No one saw or heard anything. They pulled security camera footage. There were almost none in that neighborhood. They reviewed Bukhanov's phone calls from the final days. Nothing suspicious. They examined his contacts. Everyone was clean or staying silent. A dead end. A few months later, the investigator wrote in his report, "Murder unsolved due to insufficient evidence." The case went to the archive. From time to time, it is pulled out, reviewed to see if any new leads have emerged. There are none, and there won't be. The truth about Cross-Eyed Kaira's murder most likely will never surface. Too much time has passed. Witnesses are either dead or have forgotten or don't want to speak. The client, if alive, feels safe. The killers have long spent their fee and moved on to other business. The case is closed. The story forgotten. Only legends and speculation remain. But the memory of Cross-Eyed lives on. He is remembered in Aktau. His name is still spoken in criminal circles. Young crime bosses just starting out hear stories about him, about how he rose, how he worked, how he went. These stories serve as lessons. They show that in the criminal world, there are no eternal winners. Today you're on top, tomorrow you're in the ground. Such is the price of the game. The story of Kairat Bukhanov is the tragedy of one man and the symbol of an entire era, an era that has passed without return. Kazakhstan today lives by different rules. Crime exists, but it is different, more hidden, more sophisticated. The old-school crime bosses are a thing of the past. They have been replaced by white collars, businessmen and officials who steal no less, but more elegantly. Cross-Eyed Kaira was the last of his kind, a man of the old school who left with his time. And the memory of him is the memory of an era that many want to forget, but cannot.